At 53, Dwayne Johnson does not look like a man the world would ever pity. He looks carved out of certainty. He looks untouchable. To millions, he is not even a person first. He is an image, a brand, a wall of muscle, with a smile that says nothing in life can break him. But that is the first lie fame ever told about Dwayne Johnson. Because behind the nickname, behind the billions at the box office, behind the arena lights and the red carpets, there has always been another story. A story built not on invincibility, but on humiliation, loss, depression, and pain so deep that for years he buried it beneath performance. Johnson was born on the 2nd of May, 1972, and the public story of his life is usually told as a rise to dominance. The private one is far darker. Before he was The Rock, he was just a kid born into a family that looked legendary from the outside and unstable from the inside. Wrestling was in his blood, but security was not. He has spoken openly about growing up around financial struggle, instability, and the kind of emotional pressure that teaches a young boy to become strong, long before he understands what strength actually costs. The moment that may define that pain more than any championship ever could happened when he was 15. After his family was evicted, Johnson witnessed his mother attempt suicide by walking into oncoming traffic, and he pulled her back. He later described sinking into depression after that period, a darkness he carried for years. And then came the first dream that died. Long before Hollywood, Dwayne Johnson believed football would be his future. He became a standout athlete, played at the University of Miami, was part of the 1991 National Championship program, and graduated in 1995. That should have been the beginning of a professional football career. Instead, it became the beginning of another collapse. He went undrafted, signed with the Calgary Stampeders in the CFL, and was cut only 2 months into the season. He later recalled that when that dream ended, he had just $7 to his name. That detail matters, because the public loves comeback stories, but almost never lingers on the emotional violence of the fall itself. For Johnson, football was not just a career plan, it was identity, and when it disappeared, so did a part of him. That is what makes Dwayne Johnson's life more heartbreaking than people want to admit. The world celebrates the man who kept moving. It rarely stops to ask what he was running from. He has said more than once that depression touched his life in different seasons, and one of the hardest truths about his story is that success did not erase that. In fact, some of his most polished years came while he was emotionally unraveling. Recently, Johnson reflected on the end of his marriage to Dany Garcia and said the divorce in 2007 rocked him. He described that period as another bout of depression, a time when he was trying to figure himself out while also asking what kind of father he was going to be. That confession changes the image completely. Suddenly, the smiling action star is not a symbol of perfect control. He is a man trying to stay standing while his personal life caves in behind the curtain. And still, life asked for more. In 2020, his father, WWE Hall of Famer Rocky Johnson, died at 75. For the public, it was another headline. For Dwayne Johnson, it was the loss of the man who had helped shape the mythology and the burden of his own name. Their relationship was layered, proud, difficult, meaningful, and very human. That is often the cruelest part of celebrity grief. The world sees the tribute, but not the unfinished conversations behind it. Not the silence after the cameras move on. Not the private ache of becoming the surviving son of a man whose shadow once felt impossible to escape. What makes this story even more extraordinary is that some of the relationships that could have ended in bitterness became part of his rebuilding. Johnson and Dany Garcia remained close business partners, and $7 Productions was co-founded by both of them. That fact does not make the pain smaller. It makes the story stranger, more adult, more real. This is not a fairy tale about a broken man who suddenly found light. This is a story about someone who kept carrying pain, then learned how to build with it, brick by brick, roll by roll, deal by deal, smile by smile. So when people look at Dwayne Johnson today, they see power. But power is not the most honest word for what he became. Endurance is. He survived poverty. He survived humiliation. He survived dreams that collapsed, depression that followed him, a marriage that ended, and the death of his father. The tragedy of Dwayne Johnson is not that he failed, it is that he had to become larger than life, just to keep some of his deepest wounds hidden from the world. What makes Dwayne Johnson's story so unsettling is that even after he conquered wrestling, even after he turned failure into mythology, Hollywood still did not greet him as a finished man. It greeted him as a problem to be managed, a body to be repackaged, a persona to be softened. In his first major movie phase, he was still carrying the larger-than-life identity of The Rock, and the industry around him was not entirely sure a man with that name, that build, and that history could ever be accepted as a real movie star. Vanity Fair recalled how, when he was first breaking into film, even the idea of audiences buying tickets to a movie under the name Dwayne Johnson was treated with skepticism. Johnson later explained that he briefly stopped using The Rock in that period, then realized he was tired of trying to be something he was not. That matters because reinvention sounds glamorous until you understand what it actually asks of a person. It asks you to amputate parts of yourself in public and call it growth. Johnson did not just leave wrestling behind. For a time, he seemed to be negotiating with his own identity, trying to become digestible to an industry that wanted the charisma, but not always the full truth of where it came from. And while the public now remembers the success, the box office wins, and the impossible consistency of his image, there was a period underneath all of that where he was still trying to decide whether authenticity would cost him his future. Then came another layer of heartbreak. The roles that helped stabilize him were also the roles that revealed how fragile he felt inside. Johnson has now admitted that during the collapse of his marriage to Dany Garcia, he gravitated toward easy, light, family films that made me feel good. He looked back on that time and said things were a little cloudy. That single confession changes the emotional meaning of an entire era of his career. What looked to audiences like strategic career planning now sounds more like survival. Those PG-rated films were not just branding decisions. In his own telling, they were emotional shelter. While the world saw a giant smiling through family comedies, the man inside that image was trying not to sink. And the cruel irony is that the strategy worked so well, it created a new prison. Years later, Johnson said he felt pigeonholed in Hollywood as an action star, pushed into a lane by the relentless noise of box office culture. He described the business as something that can shove a performer into a category and into a corner. And he said that a few years ago, he started asking himself a brutal question: am I living my dream, or am I living other people's dreams? That is not the question of a man drunk on success. That is the question of a man staring at his own empire and wondering how much of it he actually chose. No moment exposed that tension more publicly than Black Adam. The film was positioned as a major statement in Johnson's career, the kind of project that was supposed to confirm not just his star power, but his ability to reshape a franchise around himself. Instead, it became another reminder that even the most carefully built image can crack under public expectation. Variety reported that the film generated about $387 million globally after 7 weeks, while The Hollywood Reporter later noted that plans for a sequel were halted amid the new DC regime. For a man whose career had long been associated with momentum, this was something different. A very public stall, one that played out in headlines instead of silence. And then there was the Maui backlash, which cut for a different reason. When Johnson and Oprah Winfrey asked the public to donate to their People's Fund of Maui after the devastating wildfires, the response included sharp criticism. Johnson later said he understood why people were upset and acknowledged that he could have been better in how he approached it. The deeper sadness in moments like that is not simply bad press. It is the realization that fame can distort even an attempt to help. A public figure can mean well and still become the target. Yet by April 2024, the Associated Press reported that the fund had distributed nearly $60 million over 6 months to 8,100 adults affected by the fires. In other words, even the story of trying to do good became tangled in suspicion, image, and fallout. This is why the tragedy of Dwayne Johnson is more complicated than the internet version of it. It is not that he lost everything. It is that every time he built something enormous, it demanded another sacrifice. He escaped poverty and found pressure. He escaped obscurity and found typecasting. He built one of the most powerful brands in entertainment, and then had to ask whether the brand was swallowing the man. From the outside, that does not look like heartbreak. It looks like dominance. But from the inside, it may feel like spending half your life becoming undeniable, only to wake up and wonder whether anyone ever really let you be whole. There is another reason Dwayne Johnson's story feels more tragic than triumphant. It is because the closer he moved toward total control, the more obvious it became that control itself was the illusion. The world sees a man who built an empire out of discipline, branding, and brute force. But the emotional pattern running through his life says something harsher. Again and again, the things that shaped him most were the things he could not fully command. His mother's pain, the death of his football dream, the collapse of his marriage, the complicated love he carried for his father, and the brutal truth that even superstardom cannot guarantee how the public will receive the next chapter. What makes that especially haunting is his relationship with Rocky Johnson. For years, the public story was simple. Legendary father, legendary son, legacy passed down like a crown. But real families are never that clean. In recent interviews, Johnson spoke more candidly about the strain between them, including a serious conflict not long before Rocky's death, and the pain of unfinished business when his father died suddenly in 2020. That detail matters because grief is always heavier when it arrives, before reconciliation feels complete. It is not only loss, it is loss mixed with guilt, anger, admiration, and everything left unsaid. And maybe that is why Dwayne Johnson has always seemed to perform strength with almost superhuman precision. Men raised inside emotional chaos often do that. They become reliable before they become understood. They become useful before they become honest. Johnson's discipline, his relentless training, his carefully maintained public image, even the impossible consistency of his work ethic, can all be read as the habits of a man who learned very early that falling apart in public was a luxury he could not afford. That is an inference, but it is strongly supported by the way he has described depression, family instability, and the need to keep moving through pain rather than surrender to it. Then there is the pressure of being a symbol. Dwayne Johnson is no longer judged like an ordinary actor or even an ordinary celebrity. He is judged like an institution. Every success must be massive. Every misstep becomes a referendum. When Black Adam failed to become the franchise-changing victory many expected, it was not treated as just another disappointing movie. It became a public test of his power, his strategy, and his judgment. Johnson later said the project got caught in a vortex of new leadership at DC. But the broader emotional reality remained the same. One of the biggest stars on Earth still had to watch a high-stakes gamble slip out of his hands. That is the hidden cruelty of his life. Dwayne Johnson has spent years becoming the kind of man people assume cannot be wounded. But that assumption is its own form of loneliness. Because once the world decides you are indestructible, it stops looking for the fractures. It stops imagining the exhaustion. It stops asking what it costs to carry everyone's expectations while still carrying your own history. The bigger the icon became, the less room there was for the damaged boy underneath. That boy never fully disappeared. He just became more expensive to reveal. This is partly an interpretation, but it fits the public record of how Johnson has described moving through depression, divorce, career reinvention, and family grief, while continuing to project certainty. So the tragedy of Dwayne Johnson is not simply that he suffered. Many people suffer. It is that his suffering had to coexist with one of the most polished public images in modern entertainment. He had to smile while grieving. He had to motivate while doubting. He had to look invincible while privately enduring the same fear, heartbreak, and emotional wreckage that break ordinary people every day. And perhaps that is the saddest truth of all. The stronger the world needed him to appear, the less permission he had to be visibly human. At some point, success stopped feeling like a destination for Dwayne Johnson. It became maintenance. And maintenance is a different kind of pressure entirely, because reaching the top is a moment. Staying there is a lifetime of negotiation. Every role, every interview, every business decision, every public statement becomes part of a system that must be carefully controlled. Not because he wants to deceive the world, but because the world has already decided what he represents: strength, consistency, reliability. And once those labels attach themselves to a person, breaking them can feel more dangerous than living inside them. This is where the story becomes quietly exhausting. Johnson is not just an actor or a former wrestler anymore. He is a corporation in human form. $7 Productions, global endorsements, multi-million-dollar deals, and partnerships that stretch across industries. These are not just achievements, they are responsibilities. Entire teams, entire projects, entire financial ecosystems depend on his ability to remain exactly who the world expects him to be. That level of expectation does not just shape your career, it shapes your personality. It dictates how much of your real self you are allowed to show. And yet, in rare moments, the mask slips just enough to reveal what all of this might be costing him. Johnson has spoken about waking up at 4 a.m., about relentless discipline, about never letting up. The public reads that as motivation. But there is another way to interpret it. Sometimes, relentless motion is not just ambition. Sometimes it is avoidance. Because slowing down means sitting with everything you have been outrunning for years. The doubt, the grief, the unresolved questions about identity. That interpretation is not a claim. It is an analytical reading of patterns he himself has described. Constant work, constant movement, constant forward momentum, even during emotionally difficult periods. And then there is fatherhood. In interviews, Johnson often speaks about wanting to be a better father than the experience he had growing up. That desire is deeply human, but it also carries weight, because trying to break generational patterns is one of the hardest things a person can do. It requires awareness, patience, and a willingness to confront parts of your past that are easier to bury than to understand. When he talks about his daughters, there is a softness that rarely appears in the rest of his public persona. It is one of the few places where the armor seems to loosen. But even here, the tension remains. How do you balance being a global icon with being fully present as a father? How do you build an empire and still protect something as fragile as ordinary family moments? These are not questions unique to Dwayne Johnson, but the scale of his life magnifies them. Every hour spent on set, every international project, every obligation tied to his name is time taken from somewhere else. That is the hidden arithmetic of success. Gain in one area almost always means loss in another. By this point, the pattern is impossible to ignore. Dwayne Johnson's life is not a straight line from struggle to triumph. It is a cycle. Build, lose, rebuild, adapt, repeat, each phase larger than the last. each success more visible, each cost more hidden. The tragedy is not that he failed to escape hardship. It is that even after escaping it, he had to keep paying for it in new forms. And maybe that is the final contradiction of his story. The world looks at Dwayne Johnson and sees certainty, but if you follow the details closely, what you actually see is a man who has spent his entire life adapting to instability, first in his family, then in his career, and now at the very top of an industry that never stops shifting beneath him. That is not just resilience, it is survival at a level so constant that it almost becomes invisible. And that is why the tragedy of Dwayne Johnson was never meant to look tragic from the outside. Real tragedy rarely does. Sometimes it hides behind perfect teeth, billion-dollar franchises, sold-out arenas, and a body built to convince the world that pain could never leave a mark. But pain does not always leave scars where people can see them. Sometimes it settles deeper, in the voice, in the habits, in the need to stay busy, in the refusal to slow down long enough to hear what the silence has been trying to say all along. For most of his life, Dwayne Johnson has been turning suffering into fuel. That is one of the reasons the world admires him. He took humiliation and made it motivation. He took financial instability and made it ambition. He took heartbreak and made it discipline. He took uncertainty and built an empire so large that it almost looked like proof he had conquered every ghost behind him. But maybe that is the misunderstanding at the center of his story. Maybe conquering your past is not the same thing as escaping it. Maybe some wounds do not disappear when you win. They just become easier to hide inside success. Because if you strip away the headlines, the contracts, the entrances, the applause, what remains is not a myth. It is a man. A man who watched his mother nearly disappear in front of him. A man who lost the dream he thought would define his life. A man who went through depression when the world expected confidence. A man who endured divorce, public scrutiny, career pressure, and the complicated grief of losing a father he both loved and struggled with. None of that makes him weak, but it does make him human. And that may be the one part of his story the public has been least willing to fully accept. The saddest thing about Dwayne Johnson is not that life was cruel to him. It is that he became so good at surviving cruelty that people started mistaking survival for invulnerability. They saw the comeback, but not the cost. They saw the muscles, but not the armor. They saw the charisma, but not the loneliness that can come from being turned into a symbol before you have fully finished being a person. And once the world turns you into a symbol, it no longer asks whether you are tired. It no longer wonders whether you hurt. It only asks whether you can keep performing strength on command. That is a brutal way to live. Because there is a difference between being strong and being required to look strong at all times. One is character, the other is captivity. And for Dwayne Johnson, the line between those two things may have blurred a long time ago. The discipline that saved him may also have trapped him. The image that made him global may also have made him lonely. The empire that proved his worth may also have forced him to carry more than any one person should. So when people say Dwayne Johnson has everything, maybe they are only naming the things that can be counted. Money, fame, power, influence, legacy. But the most important parts of a life are rarely the things that can be counted. Peace cannot be counted. Closure cannot be counted. The feeling of being fully understood cannot be counted. And if those things remain incomplete, then even the most extraordinary success can still contain something profoundly sad. In the end, the tragedy of Dwayne Johnson is not that he fell apart in public. It is that he learned how not to. He learned how to smile through pain, work through grief, and keep moving through disappointment so convincingly that the world began to believe he was made of something harder than flesh. But he was never harder than flesh. He was simply more practiced at carrying weight than most people could ever imagine. And perhaps that is the most heartbreaking truth of all. The man the world calls The Rock may have spent his entire life proving that he could not be broken, while quietly carrying the evidence that he already had been. But maybe the most painful part of Dwayne Johnson's story is not found in the tragedies everyone can name. It is found in the emotional trade he seems to have made with life itself. To become who he is, Dwayne Johnson had to master a very specific skill. He had to become whatever the moment required. When his family needed stability, he became responsible. When football failed him, he became relentless. When wrestling needed charisma, he became unforgettable. When Hollywood needed a franchise machine, he became dependable. And when the world demanded inspiration, he became motivational. Again and again, he adapted. Again and again, he delivered. Again and again, he gave people exactly what they wanted. But there is always a cost when a man becomes too good at being what others need. Eventually, he risks losing access to what he needs himself. That is the hidden sadness underneath so much of Dwayne Johnson's life. He has spent decades being admired for his power. But power can become a lonely language. The stronger people think you are, the less they ask whether you are struggling. The more successful you become, the less comfortable the world is with your vulnerability. They want the quote, the smile, the comeback, the grind. They want the version of you that makes them feel motivated about their own lives. They do not always want the exhausted version, the grieving version, the uncertain version, the version that lies awake at night, wondering whether all of this effort has actually brought peace or only produced a more polished kind of pressure. And that kind of loneliness is hard to describe because it does not look lonely from the outside. It looks like winning. That is what makes it so dangerous. Because when the world keeps rewarding the mask, the person underneath may start believing the mask is the only acceptable form of truth. And for a man like Dwayne Johnson, whose entire life has been built around discipline, performance, and endurance, the temptation to stay inside that mask must be enormous. Not because he is fake, but because the machine around him is real. The industry is real. The expectations are real. The consequences of disappointing millions of people are real. At his level, even being human can start to feel like a risk. So he keeps moving. He keeps smiling. He keeps building. He keeps lifting. He keeps posting. He keeps showing the world a man in control. And maybe he is in control. But control is not the same as rest. Control is not the same as healing. Control is not the same as being free. That is the part people miss. Survival can look glamorous when it is wrapped in success. But survival is still survival. It still comes from somewhere painful. It still means some part of you learned early that stopping was dangerous, that weakness was costly, that softness had to be rationed. And once those lessons settle into a person deeply enough, they do not vanish just because money arrives. They do not vanish because fame expands. They do not vanish because the world starts calling you a legend. In some ways, they become even harder to escape. Because now the man who once fought to be seen must live with being seen by everyone, and yet truly known by very few. That may be the final heartbreak in Dwayne Johnson's story. Not that he suffered, not that he struggled, not even that he had to carry so much for so long, but that the very qualities that saved his life may also have made it harder for him to fully lay that weight down. So when people look at Dwayne Johnson and see strength, they are not wrong. They are just not seeing all of it. Because real strength is not only what a man can carry, it is also what he has survived in silence. And by that measure, Dwayne Johnson may be far more heartbreaking than the world ever wanted to believe. And perhaps that is why Dwayne Johnson's life feels so much heavier the closer you look at it. Because beneath all the triumph, there is a man who never really had the luxury of collapsing. Some people break loudly. Their pain spills into the room. Their suffering announces itself. But others learn a different method. They break in motion. They break while working. They break while providing. They break while smiling for cameras, shaking hands, delivering lines, posting motivation, and showing up exactly as the world expects. And when a person lives like that long enough, the damage becomes difficult to measure because it hides inside functionality. That may be the deepest sadness in Dwayne Johnson's story. He did not just survive pain. He learned how to make pain productive. He turned heartbreak into momentum. He turned instability into discipline. He turned rejection into ambition. He turned grief into output. And the world applauded him for it because the world always applauds visible strength. But applause can be misleading. It can make suffering look noble when in reality it is simply unresolved. It can make endurance look glamorous when in reality it is exhausting. It can make a man appear complete when in reality he is still carrying old fractures beneath the surface. And those fractures matter. Because no matter how many records are broken, no matter how many movies succeed, no matter how powerful the brand becomes, the emotional truth underneath does not disappear. The child who grew up around instability does not vanish. The young man who lost his football dream does not vanish. The son with complicated love and unfinished pain toward his father does not vanish. The husband who went through heartbreak does not vanish. The man who battled depression does not vanish. He simply becomes harder to distinguish from the icon. That is the real cost of becoming larger than life. Eventually, your humanity starts getting edited out of your own legend. People talk about your work ethic, but not what it might be protecting you from. They talk about your discipline, but not the fear that may have built it. They talk about your success, but not the emotional debt that success may have been trying to repay. And when that happens, the public no longer sees a full person. It sees a symbol, a machine, a force, a myth. But myths do not get comforted. Myths do not get permission to fall apart. Myths do not get asked whether they are okay. That is for ordinary people. And Dwayne Johnson stopped being allowed to look ordinary a very long time ago. Maybe that is why his story lingers in such an unsettling way. Because it forces us to confront something uncomfortable about fame itself. We imagine success as the end of suffering, when often it is only a new environment for suffering to continue. The pain changes shape, the pressure changes scale, the loneliness becomes more polished. But the human need for peace, understanding, and emotional rest remains exactly the same. And if those needs go unmet, then even the brightest life can contain a quiet sadness no audience ever fully sees. So yes, Dwayne Johnson became powerful. Yes, he became admired. Yes, he became one of the most recognizable men on earth. But none of that erases the possibility that somewhere beneath the empire is still a man who spent his whole life earning the right to feel safe and may still be searching for what safety actually feels like. That is not weakness. That is tragedy. Because, in the end, the most heartbreaking thing about Dwayne Johnson may not be the pain he endured in the past. It may be the possibility that even after everything he built, some part of him is still carrying it, still carrying the pressure, still carrying the grief, still carrying the expectation, still carrying the burden of being the Rock in a world that rarely leaves room for Dwayne. And that is what makes his story so haunting. Not that he rose after falling, but that he may have had to keep rising without ever being fully allowed to rest.